幾熟手，我都入過學堂。
It's Infernal Affairs, one of the best Hong Kong thrillers I think ever made, one of the best undercover cop movies ever made. It's an absolute classic. This is the Criterion edition that I have right here. This came out a couple years ago. And I want to give a big shout out to PerryFan49, who now goes by HKUSA Reviews here on YouTube, who is a longtime friend of this channel and who sent this to me very generously in the mail as a gift. And it just took me so long to get around to watching it. I apologize that it took me so long to get around to watching it. I don't know why it took me so long to get around to watching it. I had no intention of watching this movie this week. And then last night, I just felt this overwhelming urge to throw it on. So I did, and I watched it, and we are here today to talk about it. If you haven't seen this release, it's got the Infernal Affairs trilogy in it. So here you have when you pull out the case, you get this, and then you open it up, and the discs are in here. This is a Blu-ray release. It's not a 4K release, which I know is upsetting to some fans. I don't know why that is. I don't know if Criterion wasn't sure they could sell the 4Ks, in order to justify the cost of it, or there was some other reason. I do know that a lot of people were hoping that the edit that has and there's Justin Chang, who writes for Variety and has been a film critic in various other places and stuff, has an essay in here, and I always enjoy reading Justin Chang's stuff. Is very interesting and insightful and always a unique perspective on the films. I'm just seeing if there's anything else in this booklet that you might want to have a gander at. There is a 4K release, I think, in France, and maybe there are some in other parts of the world. It does not have the version that edits the movies together in like chronological order. Apparently, the reason for that is they weren't able to get the permission to include that on the release from, I guess, Media Asia or whomever owns the rights to that version. So what I'm going to do in this video is I wanted to kind of, rather than do like a traditional review or just like recite kind of information that anyone could find with a quick Google search, I thought I would kind of look at why is this movie so damn good, right? Like, we know it's famous in part. It's not, there's a lot of other reasons it's famous, but it is in part famous in the West and famous with people who are not maybe Hong Kong film fans, because The Departed, which won a bunch of Oscars, is a very famous movie and has an extremely famous cast with DiCaprio and Matt Damon and Jack Nicholson and all these people. Mark Wahlberg, Alec Baldwin is in that movie, right? Vera Farmiga, she's in that movie. She plays a psychiatrist, right? It's been a while since I've seen The Departed. The Departed is a remake of this movie, right? But it's also very famous with fans of Hong Kong cinema and Asian cinema and action movies and thrillers and stuff like that. Obviously, Amy Lau is in it, who's extremely famous. Tony Leung is in it, who's extremely famous. It has a lot of pedigree. Anthony Wong is in it, but it's special in a way that makes it really stand out from other films that have those people involved or that are of the same type, right? And I was thinking last night, as I was thinking about this movie and thinking about this review, you have like the John Woo, Chow Yun-fat, Ringo Lam, like those 80s movies, and I think kind of movies like On the Run maybe kind of fall into that because it's the same time period and stuff, same kind of era in filmmaking. And then you have the kind of Johnny Tone Milky Way movies, right? And this, I might be wrong about this, and let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about this, but it feels to me like this is like the only movie that I can think of that doesn't easily fit into one of those two buckets. And even though there are obviously similarities here stylistically, I think, with a lot of Johnny To films, that is considered among the greatest Hong Kong thrillers or like cops and criminals movies ever, triad movies, whatever you want to call them, right? It kind of stands on its own, and it has this very special aura, and it's this very unique film. And so my thought was like, let me look at why is that? Like, why is this movie so damn good? What makes it so special? Why do people love it so much? And so I'm going to try to address that a little bit through my own filter as a writer. I broke this down into two major sections. One is theme, and one is structure and character. I'm going to talk about theme first, and then I'll segue into structure and character. There will be some spoilers here, but I will let you know when spoilers are coming in case you haven't seen the movies. The movie opens, like as the credits are ending, there's a quote from a Buddhist sutra, which talks about the worst hell is the continuous hell, which is the hell that never ends. It's just constant suffering, right? And that leads directly into a scene that takes place in a Buddhist temple. That's very interesting to me. And I started thinking about Buddhism and the idea of reincarnation and this notion that you continue to live in the world, right? So if you look at like a traditional Buddhist notion of reincarnation, right? You live over and over and over again until you achieve enlightenment. You achieve some kind of special wisdom and knowledge that allows you to leave this endless cycle of inhabiting these mortal bodies and you ascend, right? And and you think about the idea of a continuous hell, right? And you connect that with this Buddhist idea of reincarnation and the setting of the Buddhist temple and of living over and over and over again. And you start to get this theme of this endless cycle of pain in life that cannot be broken. Then you look at the setup of the characters. So we don't know the setup of this film. The cops send an undercover agent in to be a mole in these gangs. One of the gangs sends a mole to the police academy, a guy who has a completely clean record and whatever, and he becomes a very successful police officer. So the gang has a mole in the cops, right? In a way, and these two moles are at the police academy at the same time, right? And in a way, there's this sense of they become one another, right? The cop goes into the criminal organization and essentially has to be a criminal in order to succeed. The criminal goes into the cops and has to be a really good cop in order to succeed. And they do succeed. They succeed really well. They're essentially switching places. It's almost a form of death and reincarnation. And this endless cycle of repetition, right? Of they become one another, but it doesn't solve anything. Nothing ends, nothing begins. It just goes and goes and goes through these cycles of, and when you think about the continuous pain aspect too, this is a film of constant paranoia, right? And so they live in a continuous hell of constantly being paranoid and anxious and worried that someone is going to find out who they are. And then you get into this notion of like split identities, which is a big theme here. And at some point, you just kind of stop knowing who you really are. And you have to live as someone else all the time. You eventually just become that other person. And then who are you really? And it's this living in this continuous hell of not being able to be free and to be relaxed and to be yourself, right? And this is a very important theme that is repeated over and over again in various ways throughout this film. Now, there is a huge spoiler here that I'm going to talk about. And this is going to tie into the next section, which is character and structure. So I'm going to kind of tie these sections of my discussion together with this, and then I'll kind of come back to some of the thematic stuff as well as I discuss character and structure. But one of the things I found so interesting upon this rewatch, which I had kind of forgotten because it's been a while since I've seen this movie, and again, huge spoiler, the Andy Lau character, who in The Departed is the Matt Damon character, does not die in this movie. And he kind of gets away with it, but we don't really know if he does. And I'll discuss that in a second when I talk about character and structure and everything. But I think his character is a lot more ambiguous than the Matt Damon character. And I think in the American movie, there's this sense of we have to have a bad guy. And the bad guy at some point has to die. So we feel like there's a sense of finality, right? There's a lot more ambiguity in this movie, which I think makes it really interesting because it blurs the lines between who is good and bad and whether either side is good or bad. And there's a heavy emphasis in this film upon choice and the choices that characters make and how choice determines the life that you live. And in a way, it's about this idea that people keep making the same stupid fucking mistakes over and over and over again, generation after generation. We do not receive the wisdom that is there for us to understand. We have to make our own decisions. We have to live our own lives and then realize these things ourselves and realize we've done stupid shit instead of listening to what we should have listened to in the first place, right? And it's just this endless cycle of fucking up. And there's a great quote in the very first scene in the movie. The Eric Sang character, who's the head of the gang, he's like the head triad. He says, "You have the power to take fate into your own hands." And he's saying that to like encourage these young Yakuza guys who are going on this mission of like going undercover with the cops for him. And this is very similar to A Better Tomorrow in the temple scene when the Chow Yun-fat character says that like any man could be a god if you could control your own fate, right? But it's in a Buddhist temple and this idea of like you can make you can have power by making decisions, right, and determine your own fate. I think there's this thematic idea of like anyone could walk away from this at any point. And yes, there's this thing of like, well, they know who I am, and like I'd have to leave Hong Kong, I'd have to leave family, but like there are stakes, right? But you make decisions that get you into these places, and you make decisions that get you stuck and deeply entrenched in these places. And then it's impossible to get out of that cycle of the continuous hell of like violence and paranoia and the loss of your sense of self and identity and morality and all of these things, right? But it's not, the system is there, and the system exists, and the system consumes these young people's lives and feeds them lies and like uses them and stuff, but you do have to make the decision to become involved in that system in the first place. So it's an interesting thing, like of there's this notion of the inescapability and the futility of trying to do anything in this endless cycle, and yet at the same time you do have to make a decision that puts you into that cycle. So there's this kind of duality there. Again, with the duality of these two characters who are kind of like doppelgangers who become one another, who die and are reincarnated as one another's. I think thematically, this is a very rich, deep, and interesting film. And like the average person who's watching this movie is probably not actively thinking about these things. I wasn't the first couple times I saw this movie, right? But it's there. And you kind of intuitively absorb it through the greatness of how the film is presented, right? And so even if you're not actively thinking about it, you can receive it in a way that I think is impactful and improves the experience of watching the film. So to get into structure and character, the narrative economy of this film is incredible. Like there's nothing here that doesn't need to be here. There's nothing extraneous, there's nothing unnecessary. Like it's so concise and powerful and direct. It opens with the scene in the Buddhist temple, and then you have basically a montage of these two characters in a way switching sides. Like the cop goes undercover, the criminal becomes the cop, they become adults, and then essentially we hop into their adulthood. We have a couple scenes. There's like I think two or three scenes that establish their characters, which is necessary, right? This is who they are as adults, right? And this is the life that they're living in, the places that they find themselves. Now, I do want to point out, it's the scene, the first proper scene of drama in this film, like after the intro, essentially, where we meet the two characters as adults, they run into each other at this stereo store. And that scene could literally have been set anywhere, right? There's two things I think in particular that are so brilliant about setting this in this stereo store. One, it shows a lot of commonalities. They sit down and they listen to music together as they're testing these stereos, and they're trying different cables. Like, they'll try this cable, it'll sound better with this cable. And he's like, oh, you're right. And like, you see this shared passion and this shared love of music. They also talk about the oldies and how to listen to the oldies, and this sense of like nostalgia and things that have been lost that ties them together in what they're doing, right? Of these lost identities, these lost youths and things like that, right? And so it's this really, and like everyone loves music. Everyone in the world loves music, right? So even if you don't like the music that's playing in that scene, the emotions of the scene hit you because it's these two people who are very similar in a lot of ways, but who are diametrically opposed to one another in the narrative of the film, and who are like, one another's essential like opposite numbers, if you want to call it that. They come together over this profound, beautiful moment of loving music and wanting to find like a stereo. But there's also some setup and payoff. Spoiler here. And I'm talking about structure here. The structure of this film is so fucking perfect. The stereo becomes a plot point later in the movie. And the idea of like a CD and of listening to something on a CD through this stereo system becomes a plot point. So it sets up character in this really deep and beautiful way, but it also sets up an important piece of a story that is going to come back later and that will tie these characters together. And I guess I can give a spoiler here. If you've seen the film, you know that eventually a recording of Andy Lau revealing that he is the mole and that he's the criminal who's undercover in the cops is given to his fiance, I think she's his fiance, by the Tony Lung character for her to listen to on this stereo. So it ties everything together, right? And that ties back to the theme of like, who are those people and what are these lives that they're living and where is the true self, right? And interestingly enough, not interestingly enough, but very well placed by the writers. His Andy Lau's fiance or girlfriend or whatever she is a novelist, and she's writing a book about person with split personality who doesn't know who they are, right? So like everything kind of ties back into this theme that I think is really beautifully handled, and like that's obvious, but it's obvious in a good way because it hands it to the audience and is like, here you go, this is like something that we're talking about here, and like get that idea into your head and think about it with regards to these characters, right? Sometimes obvious is good, like sometimes it works well, and I think this film has enough ambiguities in it that the more obvious stuff still works, right? Um, Speaking of structure, this is a small thing, but I think this movie has one of the best instances of setup and payoff I've ever seen. If you don't know what setup and payoff is, it's exactly what it sounds like. You set something up early in a movie so that you can pay it off later in a movie, right? The envelope in this film, one of the greatest fucking setups and payoffs ever in the history of cinema. I truly believe that, right? And what it is, huge spoiler, again, there's a setup of this envelope that is in the possession of the criminals, right? That has some writing on it that's very distinct. That is then found by the Tony Lung character in the police station in the Andy Lau character's office, which is how he figures out that the Andy Lau character is the mole. It's simple, but it's so fucking good, and it is so perfectly organically integrated into the fabric of the film. So this is what I wanted to talk about specifically with regard to structure and character, is that this film exists in a really interesting space because it is very much what I call a clockwork thriller, which is a movie where the script, everything is immaculately placed like a watch, like perfect clockwork, right? And and if any single piece is out of place, the whole thing kind of falls apart. It's immaculate, it's perfect. And yet it is very character driven. And a character driven thriller is a very different style of writing. And yet somehow they have taken both of those and mashed them together in this really perfect way where everything feels very organically derived from who these people are, the decisions that they make, again, going back to the idea of decision making, and how that drives the story forward. And yet at the same time, it has to be so perfectly arranged and balanced. That's really, really hard to do when you write, right? It's easy to reverse engineer character points to tie easily into plot points to make it seem like you're doing an organic character driven thriller. But that can be easily sussed if you have experience reading scripts, which I do, or if you're experienced as a writer, or like you've watched a lot of these movies. You can see that they're reverse engineering things and that they don't feel organic to the film, that they're just kind of putting them there to fill in logic and stuff like that, right? That is not the case here. Like this is a perfectly conceived character piece that is also a perfectly conceived kind of like clockwork thriller, and that's very difficult to do. Now, to return to the idea of structure, right? You have the intro, you have the setup of the characters, then you get this essentially master scene, which is one of, I think, the greatest thriller scenes ever, and could be its own short film, which is the drug deal scene, where you have the Tony Lung character, spoilers, undercover with the gang, trying to feed information to the cops who are across the street in a different building waiting to run in and arrest everybody. Andy Lau is over there trying to feed information to the criminals, and the power balance within the scene just keeps tipping back and forth and back and forth. But that scene sets up, so the opening sets up the world of the movie, which is you have these undercover agents, right? The plot of the movie, like the A to B plot of the movie, is criminals got to find out who the cop in their organization is. Cops have to find out who the criminal in their organization is. That is set up by this master scene, right? So it's like this perfect build in structure. Set up the world, set up the kind of the what you call the status quo, which is like what is normal in this world. It's the idea that you have undercover agents on both sides, right? So you establish what the world is, you establish the status quo, you establish kind of like the overarching framework. You settle on these characters and come to understand them in the day-to-day rhythms. And then you establish what is the second act plot, the A to B story of the film, all neatly placed perfectly in a row, right? It's so good. And that scene, like I cannot overemphasize how good that scene is. And there's multiple scenes in this movie that I really think could be taken out and just be like their own like short films because they're just so perfect. Now, another thing that I think is so great about the structure of this film that I think ties back into theme and is important to character is that as the movie goes along, we slowly start to understand that there are more moles in both organizations. There are other undercover cops that Tony Leung doesn't know about, and there are other undercover criminals in the cops that Andy Lau doesn't know about. And they start to discover these people, and that starts to radically shift our perception of what the theme is here, because we realize that what they're doing doesn't matter at all. They're only the protagonists because we are following them. There could have been a completely different movie made in which one of these other undercover cops or undercover criminals were the central characters, right? Like there's all these other dramas happening concurrently that are all tragic and all express the same themes. And it again reiterates this notion of like everything they're doing is pointless and they're in this endless cycle of pain and they can never escape it, right? Which ties back into theme and and choice and things of that matter, and this dichotomy between fate and choice, which is I think central to this film. But what also makes it really interesting is that it becomes kind of an emotional plot point, because at some point towards, and again, huge spoilers, but there's a lot of huge spoilers in here. And this is going to tie back to another point I made earlier, and then this will be the last thing I say about this movie. But the Andy Lau character at some point decides he doesn't want to be a criminal anymore. He just wants to be a cop. Like he likes being a cop. He likes living a good life, like earning a salary, having this fiance, having a nice place to live, like having these buddies on the police force. Like that means something to him. And he realizes that. And he realizes he can't do that while the head criminal is still alive because he's his guy, right? So he kills that guy, which happens in The Departed too. Have you seen The Departed? Spoiler alert. But then he starts to realize slowly that he's not the only one, and that there are other guys who know who he is. And so what does he do? Do they form this kind of covenant where they're like, we're not going to tell anybody and we're just going to, you know what I mean? Or is one of them or two of them or three of them, are they going to be like, well, we're still criminals. Like, let's go work for a different boss, or like he cannot control what these other people are going to do, and he doesn't know who they all are. So is he going to kill them all? Like, is he going to hunt them down and find them and kill them? And then in trying to be a good person, does he become a bad person? And I think that's this very interesting thematic ambiguity in this film, where at the very, very end, Andy Lau's character does probably the most cold-blooded thing he's done in the entire movie. And I guess since we're spoiling everything, I'll just tell you what it is. Huge spoiler, but he, in cold blood, just point blank shoots one of the other undercover criminals because he's like, I can't have this guy revealing my identity. And then, so he's decided to be good. He ends up having to be really bad. And then he steps out of this elevator and there's all these other cops there. And he's like, it's okay, I'm a cop. So in the moment that he decides to be good, he ends up having to be really bad in order to try to preserve that. And then at the end, he just says, I'm a cop, right? So is he a cop the whole time? Is there no difference between the cops and the criminals? Is this like a zero-sum game? And again, tied back into that beautiful theme that I think it's an ambiguous movie in the best way. Not because they didn't figure out what they wanted to say, but because what they're saying is about a very ambiguous world and theme and ambiguous characters where everything is kind of slippery and fluid and gray. And I think in that lies the greatness of this film and a lot of its profundity. So the movie is Infernal Affairs. You are watching Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. My name is Will. Thank you so much for watching. There's a lot more to think and to write and to say about this film. This is just kind of my short thoughts upon it after rewatching. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.